What would it mean to think so clearly that you never made a bad decision again? Not never made a mistake. Mistakes are inevitable, woven into the fabric of being human. But what if your thinking itself was so disciplined, so stripped of noise and distortion, that every decision you made came from a place of pure, undiluted clarity? What if the fog that clouds most people's judgment, the fear, the ego, the half-truths they tell themselves, simply wasn't there anymore? This is the standard Miyamoto Musashi held himself to. A man who walked through over 60 sword duels without losing a single one. A man who spent decades alone, writing, thinking, refining, not just his technique, but his mind. His philosophy, distilled in the Book of 5 Rings, is not a manual on swordsmanship. It is a manual on how to see reality as it actually is, not as you wish it to be, not as you fear it might be, but as it is, plainly, directly, without ornament. The 5 lessons that follow are drawn from that philosophy. They are not motivational platitudes. They are not soft suggestions. They are the kind of truths that, once you genuinely internalize them, quietly reorganize how you see everything. Lesson 1. Do not think dishonestly. Musashi's very first principle in the Book of 5 Rings is deceptively simple. Do not think dishonestly. He doesn't say, be honest with others. He says, be honest in your thinking. That is a far more demanding discipline, and most people never attempt it seriously. Dishonest thinking is not the same as lying. You can be completely truthful in everything you say to the world and still be a deeply dishonest thinker. Dishonest thinking is the quiet, internal process by which you distort reality to protect your ego. It is the way you convince yourself that the reason you didn't pursue your dream was circumstances, not fear. It is the story you tell yourself about why a relationship failed, in which you are always more right than wrong. It is the way you evaluate information, accepting what confirms what you already believe, dismissing what challenges it. Psychologists call this confirmation bias. Musashi would have called it a path to death, because in a duel, as in life, if you are seeing what you want to see instead of what is actually there, you are going to get hurt. Honest thinking requires something that most people find uncomfortable: a willingness to be wrong. Not just technically wrong about some isolated fact, but fundamentally wrong. About yourself, about your abilities, about your assumptions. Musashi spent decades deliberately traveling alone, taking on challenges, refusing the comfort of a permanent home or the flattery of students. He was stress-testing his thinking constantly, because he understood that a mind that is never challenged atrophies into arrogance. The practice of honest thinking begins with a simple but ruthless habit. When you form an opinion, ask yourself how you arrived at it. Did you reason your way to this conclusion, or did you start with the conclusion and work backward to justify it? The first is thinking. The second is something else entirely. It looks like thinking, it feels like thinking, but it is really just rationalization wearing thinking's clothes. Start noticing where your reasoning is motivated by comfort rather than truth. Where are you protecting an idea not because it is correct but because it is yours? Where are you avoiding a line of thought because of where it might lead? These are the corners of your mind where dishonest thinking lives. Musashi would say, go into those corners. That is exactly where the real work happens. Lesson 2. The way is in training. Understand that clarity is built, not given. One of the most dangerous lies the modern world tells about intelligence is that it is fixed, that some people are naturally clear thinkers and others are not. Musashi would have rejected this absolutely. He did not believe in natural genius. He believed in relentless practice. His famous phrase, "The way is in training," was not about sword practice alone. It was a statement about the nature of mastery in any domain. Clarity of mind is not a trait you are born with. It is a skill you build, day after day, through deliberate effort. What does it mean to train your thinking? It means practicing the act of slowing down when your instinct is to rush to judgment. Most people think in flashes. An impression forms, and they treat it as a conclusion. But an impression is just raw material. Actual thinking is what you do with that raw material. You examine it, you question it, you hold it up to the light and look for flaws. This process takes time, and in a culture that rewards speed and punishes hesitation, most people skip it entirely. Training your thinking also means deliberately exposing yourself to perspectives that challenge your own. Musashi spent years studying painting, calligraphy, poetry, and strategy, not because these things were directly related to sword fighting, but because he understood that a mind trained in one domain becomes brittle. It starts to assume that the patterns it knows from one field are universal. Exposure to different ways of thinking keeps a mind flexible, adaptive, and honest. There is a specific practice worth adopting here: the pre-mortem. Before committing to any significant decision, imagine that you have already executed that decision and it has failed completely. Now ask yourself, why did it fail? What did you miss? What assumptions did you make that turned out to be wrong? This exercise forces your thinking out of optimism bias and into honest assessment. It trains your mind to see what it would rather ignore. The deeper point Musashi is making is that a clear mind is not a passive state you arrive at. It is an active practice you maintain. The moment you stop training, the moment you decide you know enough, that is when the fog begins to creep back in. Lesson 3. Become acquainted with every art. See the pattern beneath the surface. Musashi had an unusual prescription for clear thinking that most people overlook. Study everything. Not just your own field. Everything. He writes in the Book of 5 Rings that a warrior should be acquainted with every art, and he lived this instruction. He was a painter, a sculptor, a calligrapher, a poet, and a strategic theorist, in addition to being the greatest swordsman of his age. Why does this matter for clear thinking? Because every discipline has its own way of seeing. When you only know one domain deeply, you unconsciously assume that the world works the way your domain works. A businessman starts to see every relationship as a transaction. A soldier starts to see every conflict as a war. A psychologist starts to see every problem as a trauma. These are not failures of intelligence, they are failures of range. When you study multiple domains seriously, something extraordinary begins to happen. You start to see the underlying patterns that connect them. You start to recognize that the principle governing how a river finds the most efficient path to the sea is the same principle governing how a market finds an efficient price. You start to see that the tension between simplicity and complexity in music is the same tension in architecture, in writing, in strategy. Musashi saw this. He understood that the principles of sword fighting, distance, timing, rhythm, the management of force, were universal. They appeared in every domain of human endeavor, wearing different costumes. This kind of pattern recognition is one of the most powerful cognitive tools available. It allows you to solve new problems by drawing on insights from unrelated fields, which is exactly what the deepest thinkers throughout history have always done. Darwin drew on economics to understand biology. Einstein drew on thought experiments from physics to understand the nature of time. Musashi drew on aesthetics, nature, and strategy to understand everything. The practical implication is this: make a deliberate effort to learn about fields that have nothing to do with your primary work. Read history. Study philosophy. Learn the basics of how different sciences work. Not to become an expert in everything, but to expand the library of patterns your mind can draw on. A narrow mind sees only the specific. A broad mind sees the general, and it is at the level of the general where real clarity lives. Lesson 4. Know the difference between confusion and clarity, and learn to wait. There is a moment that every serious thinker knows, the moment when you are deep in a problem and nothing is resolving. The variables won't align. Every path seems to lead to a contradiction. The mind is full of noise, and the harder you push, the louder it gets. Most people in this moment do one of two things. They either force a conclusion, grab the nearest available answer just to end the discomfort, or they give up entirely, deciding the problem is too complex to solve. Musashi would say that both of these responses are failures of discipline. The correct response is to wait with intention. This is perhaps the most counterintuitive of his principles because it looks passive from the outside. But waiting with intention is deeply active. It means holding the problem in your mind without forcing it to resolution. It means continuing to gather information, continuing to observe, but resisting the urge to decide before the picture is clear. Musashi's concept of perceiving things without effort, the state he called mushin, or no mind, is not about switching off your thinking. It is about creating a mental state in which thinking can operate without distortion from anxiety or ego. In practical terms, this means developing a tolerance for ambiguity. Most cognitive errors do not come from insufficient information. They come from a desire to resolve uncertainty too quickly. When you are under pressure, when the people around you demand an answer, when your own discomfort pushes you toward premature closure, the temptation to decide before you are ready becomes almost overwhelming. Musashi understood this. His entire practice was designed to make him immune to that pressure, to create a mind that could remain calm and observant while everything around it was in chaos. The discipline here is learning to distinguish between two different mental states. Genuine confusion, which means you do not yet have enough information or perspective, and false confusion, which is actually just discomfort masquerading as uncertainty. Genuine confusion requires patience and more observation. False confusion requires only courage, the courage to acknowledge what you already, on some level, know. One way to develop this skill is to practice sitting with questions deliberately. Instead of immediately searching for the answer when you encounter a difficult question, hold it for a day. Write it down. Let your subconscious work on it. Return to it. This is not laziness. It is the cultivation of a mind that is patient enough to see clearly rather than fast enough to see immediately. Lesson 5. Do not pursue the taste of good food. Free your mind from craving and attachment. The final lesson is the most philosophical and in many ways the most radical. Musashi lived with extraordinary austerity. He famously never bathed regularly, never married, never accumulated wealth or comfort. This was not a failure of ambition. It was a deliberate practice. He understood something about the relationship between desire and clarity that most modern people have not seriously considered. Craving distorts perception. When you want something badly enough, you stop thinking about it clearly. Your mind starts filtering every piece of incoming information through the lens of that desire, emphasizing what supports the outcome you want, minimizing what threatens it. This is not a character flaw. It is simply how the human mind works. Desire is a powerful force, and like any powerful force, it has to be managed consciously or it will manage you. Musashi's principle, do not pursue the taste of good food, is not a call to asceticism for its own sake. It is a practical instruction about mental hygiene. It is saying, be careful about what you become attached to, because your attachments will become your blind spots. This applies not just to material desires, but to intellectual ones. One of the most subtle and damaging forms of attachment is attachment to your own ideas. When you have spent significant time and energy developing a position, a theory, a plan, it becomes yours, and once it is yours, you are no longer objective about it. You defend it not because the evidence supports it, but because it is an extension of your identity. This is the kind of attachment that causes brilliant people to make catastrophic errors of judgment. The practice Musashi suggests, whether consciously or not, is what is sometimes called strong opinions loosely held. Develop your thinking vigorously, commit to your best current understanding, but hold it lightly enough that new evidence can move you. The mark of a clear mind is not that it never changes, it is that it changes appropriately, in response to reality rather than in response to social pressure or emotional discomfort. There is a specific cognitive discipline that flows from this. Before making any important decision, ask yourself what you would think if you had no stake in the outcome. Remove yourself from the picture. If a stranger came to you with this exact situation, this exact set of facts, what would you advise them? Very often, this simple reframing cuts through the noise of attachment and reveals the answer that was there all along. Musashi lived this principle more completely than almost anyone. He walked away from wealth, from recognition, from comfort, not because he was indifferent to these things, but because he understood that indulgence in them would cost him something more valuable, the ability to see clearly. In his world, unclear thinking cost you your life. In ours, it costs us something only slightly less permanent, the quality of every decision we make, every relationship we build, every problem we try to solve. The compound effect of clear thinking. These 5 lessons are not independent. They work together in a compound way, each one reinforcing and deepening the others. Honest thinking makes it easier to wait for clarity rather than rushing to a comfortable conclusion. Training your mind expands your pattern recognition so that when you do perceive something, you are perceiving it with more precision. Broad learning keeps your thinking flexible. Managing your attachments keeps your perception clean. What Musashi was describing, taken as a whole, is not a thinking technique. It is a way of being, a total orientation of the self toward reality rather than toward comfort or ego protection. It is demanding. Most people will read these principles, nod in agreement, and continue thinking exactly as they always have. That is not a criticism. It is simply the nature of the work. Real change in how you think requires the same quality of commitment that Musashi brought to his sword. Daily, unglamorous, relentless practice. But the reward is proportionate to the effort. A mind that thinks clearly, that sees without distortion, that waits without anxiety, that learns without attachment to what it already knows, is one of the rarest and most valuable things a human being can develop. In a world full of noise, of manipulation, of competing narratives and constant distraction, the ability to think clearly is not just a cognitive advantage. It is, in the truest sense of the word, a form of freedom. Musashi earned that freedom in the mountains and on the dueling grounds of feudal Japan. The same freedom is available to anyone willing to do the work, not with a sword, but with the same quality of attention, the same commitment to seeing what is actually there. That work begins, as Musashi always said it did, with a single principle: do not think dishonestly.